armor looks so easy to paint, but that perceived simplicity can be deceiving. And often it's a lot trickier than we think. But don't worry, the Deathwatch Kill Team is finally here. When I started to paint mine, I thought it would be a good idea to go over why painting black armor is one of my favorite things to do, just because it offers so many possibilities. However, this video is also about my all-time favorite way to paint that maybe got a bit lost in the last few years while trying to focus on more widely accepted approaches. Ultimately though, while I always try to make my videos valuable, I believe this one is the most valuable video in a while, because it will touch on so many different concepts that I learned during the past 20 years of painting, and I'm sure you will benefit from these too. When I got the new box, I was pretty excited. After all, when I started this journey, Deathwatch was among the first things that I ever painted. I just knew before painting these new versions up, I wanted to add my own personal twist to these models. So I did a little bit of plastic surgery. Quick shout out to my local game store, Siren Games. Thanks a lot for providing the box and for always supporting the channel. Miniature kits have always been more like a suggestion to me. I often look at them and say to myself, yeah, this looks good, but do you know what would look even better? Now come the cutter knives and epoxy clay. And before you know it, my workspace is full of hacked off pieces. The Deathwatch are perfect for this too. With their obscure lore, storytelling is just baked into that. You can add as many or as little elements of their original chapter, play around with strategically placed specks of colors and symbols. Or not. When I saw the previews, I wasn't a big fan of mixing different armor classes, so I wanted to upgrade my head taker from Phobos to normal Tacticus armor. I liked the big knife however, but I think this kind of knife usually only comes with Phobos armor minis. At least I don't know of any normal Space Marines that have it. So I had to transplant it to a new arm. I also wanted to change the way it was held, so on the new arm I cut that itty bitty blade from the top and glued the parry-guard of the big blade right to the underside of the handle. And also recycled the butt of the knife and just glued it on top of the fist where the small blade used to be. With the main element in place, I tried to find a proper gun arm that supported the pose and finally settled on this one. I made this guy a blood angel because obviously he's a close combat enjoyer, and that red shoulder and that final pose together with the facial expression is going to work really well. The new Deathwatch looked really tech focused and I wanted to dial it down a notch, so on my Salamander's Horde Slayer I went a little lighter and at the same time added a little nod to this guy's origin by putting this pyre on instead. I don't have the Salamander's upgrade sprue, so I had to 3D print mine, and I took apart from the Great Tide Studio Eternal Pilgrim set that was the perfect fit. However, I had to upscale it because it was tiny. First I blew it up to double the size, but that was a bit overkill, so I used the 1.5 upscaling and that worked. It also supported the leaning pose nicely, weaving to the opposite side as he shifts his weight backwards. I also wanted a small flame at the front of the flamethrower, if only for having the justification to add a little OSL there, but also because it's just that tiny bit more realistic. And I just snipped off a part of that flame that looked fitting and glued it on. These third-party bits are just so important to me nowadays, especially in a time where Games Workshop doesn't provide you with a lot of variety. And I'm a little sad that even though this is a lot bigger than the old Deathwatch box, you only get one Storm Shield and only one Thunder Hammer anymore, and don't even think about getting a spare cloak somewhere. So here, yet again, these Great Tide Studio cloaks came in handy. I just want to use them everywhere, plaster all my Marines and cloaks, and this one would make my leader stand out. You probably recognize it from my Mark II Salamanders video, so I had to get rid of a few extra details. But that ultimately gave me a smooth and wavy cloak that also supported the pose nicely after I put on the sword. I'm also giving all my Deathwatch guys Mark 8 helmets just because I find the vibe it gives a lot more fitting. And this is probably my favorite mod, my Space Wolves based Aegis, for which I took a minimalistic Space Wolves themed body, only that little wolf skull gives it away. And since I wanted to have him stand there with a hammer on the shoulder and the other hand resting on his shield, I had to do a lot of cutting, starting with the leg joints here and then finding legs that suited the pose. There's nothing like a little blue tack session to see if everything fits together as intended, so you don't start to glue parts together only to realize that nothing fits. Glue first, regret later is how the Emperor ended up on the Golden Throne after all. And you definitely don't want to start prying apart plastic glue bonded parts. At that point you might as well start over. The best way to do the hammer pose was grabbing a bolt to hand, because they come in so many variations, something will just fit. I then hacked off the bolter and hand and attached the parts with plastic glue, so I had a bit of time to wiggle it around. The arm holding the shield was easier to do than I anticipated. I could just use the spare sword arm from the box, and I just cut until I had the hand left. I cut off the thumb with surgical precision, if I might say so myself, and kept it so I could reattach it in the new pose so smoothly it would make Fabius Bile reconsider his career choices. I hollowed out the hand and tried to keep as many fingers as possible. Not all of them could be saved though, because they got in the way of the shield and had to be sacrificed to the conversion gods. And then I tried to find a proper position, having to nip and tuck a little here and there while posing and gluing together the final form. I gave this guy the head I had left over from my Wolf God battle leader, and I think it's an awesome fit. Reattaching the thumb with the help of a little blue tack and plastic glue was a breeze, and last but not least I had to redo the two fingertips I had to cut away with some epoxy clay. Obviously my Aegis needed a bigger tactical rock his foot could rest on, so I added a little slope that also adds a counterweight to the angle of the shield on the other side. And I also supported some poses, like my Blade Master this way. I simply wanted him to have a little more forward momentum. Now, there's one more missing for a full kill team of 5, but I want to make a bit of a special video about that last one. But with that, most of my kill team stands ready, a patchwork of heroes drawn from different worlds, united by oaths older than the Imperium itself. Each warrior will carry the scars and cals of their chapter, remind us of where they came from and what they have lost. But here in the Deathwatch, all of that fades beneath black ceramides. So before they can bring the Emperor's wrath to the Xenos, let's give them their war paint. I decided to start painting the brother I invested the most conversion work into first. Even though the result looks like a subtle change, I think it has the biggest impact. And this video kinda started off with me just wanting to paint minis that are part of my favorite Games Workshop background ever, and to relive a bit of nostalgia. And also, it's the OG Kill Team. But I quickly realized there's a lot of concepts packaged into what is going to happen during the next few minutes. And that makes it a video I know I will refer people to a lot in the future. First, of course, the obvious part is how to paint the black that's looking good. But second, black is also such a great color to learn how to blend with. And I'm going to explain why. As I went through the painting process, I realized there's two more interesting things going on that will be surprising for a lot of folk. I'm looking at you speed painting enjoyers, but we will get to that. Let's now focus on what I did to make this black armor look good. Technically, you could paint black armor just by mixing different ratios of black and white. But just like with old black and white pictures that turn a lot more interesting with that sepia discoloration, adding a little color to our first highlight layers will make this black armor look a lot more intriguing. To get a good idea of the direction I wanted to go, I pulled a lot of references, mainly Deathwatch artwork. But anything that can give us ideas about black is going in here. Like, just look at my man Darth here. There is purple in the cloak, which gives it a different quality from the polished helmet, and shoulder areas that retain the purple in some of the shadow areas, but have more of a blue quality in the highlights. And then a more neutral gray in whatever material this is to set it apart from the rest. Also, some of the cloak is clearly influenced by other ambient light, and of course the lightsaber. This artwork here is also a good example for using purple to create a moody black. The only limit here is your imagination. Something that I've been doing for each of my projects for a while now is saving all of these thought processes for later, and Milanote has been a godsend for that. Finally, I can keep all my inspirations and reference material in one place, because let's face it, I'm a mess, and if I don't write these things down, I will never be able to remember them. Milanote is an online organization tool designed to brainstorm, plan, and collaborate on projects, and it also helped me flesh out this Deathwatch project. And one thing I really like about Milanote is the simplicity. I can literally just copy and paste whatever I want, and it will find its place in my board in a presentable way. Like here on what will be the landing page for this project, I'm collecting video references on similar topics. So everyone that works on this board or anyone I want to share the information with can be up to speed immediately. The next thing I usually do is create a mood board where I just drop every visual inspiration I have, so everything is in one place. You can drag pictures from your hard drive or anything you find in your browser. And I can scroll through this and look at everything I collected as a whole, or view the pictures one by one. Another thing I will add to my board is all the colors I'm using as the project progresses. For example, the blues and grays I use for the armor, and then also the yellows and orange tones for the pauldron of the chapter. Now I have all my color recipes in one place, accessible from anywhere on the planet. My project is time sensitive. I can add to-do lists and tick off the boxes one by one, or drop in subboards for different aspects like what basing material I want to use. I love that I can just drop visual indicators and notes to point out where I got the ideas from and how to use them. And since I'm such a visual person, I like that I can just scribble on notes and sketches if I want to. And oh, there's a color picker included in here, which is a cool thing when you're analyzing artworks like we did before. So not only does Milanote serve me as a perfect planning and archiving tool, it also makes a lot of my workflow steps so much more convenient and saves me a lot of time on top. And since everyone is different in how they want to structure their projects, Milanote accommodates different ways of thinking and organizing your ideas. They offer pre-made templates to account for that. There's something to get you started no matter what you need it for. Filmmaking, writing, interior design, or planning your next Warhammer army. Milanote is available for free without any limit, and you can sign up using the link in the description to start planning your next creative project right away. I know you'd like me to give you a recipe here, but instead I'll do the give a man a fish and he's going to be fed for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll never be hungry again approach. And for what I'm going to be doing here, we need 3 paints. A black is obviously a given, and then a saturated color, in my case dark turquoise, and a color to make everything brighter that's kind of in the same hue. And for that I'm using this blue-gray here. I'm adjusting the mix until my result looks slightly blue, but passes off more like a gray than a blue on first sight. In the context of black, it's obviously going to look blue, and that's exactly the goal here. The 3 paints I'm using become a set of levers I can push and pull and adjust to my needs. If I want that layer to be darker, I'll add more black. If I want more saturation, I'm adding more turquoise. And do I want less saturation or do I want to go brighter? Adding more of the gray is going to do the trick. What I do here is map out where my highlights go. I'm generally trying to add highlights using a common light source, but if that feels overwhelming, don't overthink it. Just start somewhere and don't get stuck in analysis paralysis. Just have fun and enjoy the process. At this stage you can always repaint parts you don't like with black and start over. The trick is not to overdo it and still have most of the mini to actually be black, but it's that last third or quarter that's going to make all the difference. In my case, the general light source is coming from top right, but I'm putting that highlight on the leg more center facing because it looks more dramatic in the money shot, and that space would be rather empty without it. I keep sketching and defining all the major shapes like that spherical knee, and I make sure the layers are opaque. And again, don't worry about blending yet. If you are in a hurry to get your minis out, you don't even have to blend at all. And as you can see, I make sure to add bounce lights and secondary highlights at this point, so on the lower side of the sphere, but also the other side of the leg. Just keep in mind that these highlights should always be smaller than the main highlights. And in the case of a sphere, they're going to be divided by a really dark area. So while I put down the highlight on the chest, let's talk about what the idea behind this layer is. Like I said, using a chromatic color while doing this first layer is going to set the mood. Yes, things that are black exist in just grayscale too, but why should we limit ourselves to that when doing something creative? Adding some color gives us an additional layer of expression that we would otherwise miss out on. You could use a purple instead of blue like we saw in the artworks, or a warm gray. You can use a green or go with whatever color is in the environment of the mini to make it fit into the scene. Basically whatever story you want to tell is on the table. A blue tint generally communicates that this is a really reflective armor and will be influenced by the color of the sky, just like we saw with Darth Vader. But a cold blue also underlines the clinical, relentless and merciless ways of the Deathwatch when dealing with the Xenos threats. So after I'm done with sketching in all major and secondary reflections, and if you're unsure where to put these highlights, you can always look at reference shapes to get a better understanding. Now I'm going back to black and using a glaze consistency, I'm putting layers of thinned down paint over the edge of the opaque layers I applied. And as you can see, I usually start in the bright layer and I'm dragging the paint outwards. So most of the black accumulates where there is already black. Because what usually happens when you take the brush off the surface is that it leaves a pool of paint behind. And this way we don't care about that effect at all. On the cylindrical shapes I usually just drag the brush parallel to the cylinder's direction, because if there is any brush strokes showing, it just looks like a real reflection pattern. But of course you can also experiment with pigment pushing and dragging the paint from the bright to the darker area. I do this step a couple of times. A number of thin layers is always better than 1 or 2 thick layers, but then I use an unthinned layer of black, and preferably this is at least a satin black, because you want a bit of shine in there, and I bring back some of the pure black in the darkest areas. You can see that the wet paint looks a lot darker than the dried paint, and when we have a slightly glossy finish, our black will also appear darker. And we want that pitch black at least in some places to make it look good. You can very well start off of a glossy or satin black, it's just that this doesn't read well on camera. So I went for a matte primer, and I kind of have to add the shine back in some places. Then I'm also adding edge highlights. At this point it's more about defining every edge equally, so our final result will look crisp. Now adding more of the blue-gray, I'm going for brighter, more confined highlights. Again, using an opaque color and again not caring too much about blending at this point. Just get these highlights going. At this point I'm also focusing more on the edges facing up, and when it comes to the other highlights, you can see that I first keep them confined and I always let them dry before I continue. Because while the layers are still wet, they are brighter, and only once they are dry I know how it will look in the final result. Then I can decide how white I need to make them and if I have to go brighter or darker. And of course I'm not straying from the patterns and directions I used before to apply my brush strokes. I will also make edge highlights wider and brighter where the reflections on the surfaces meet the edges, which is how light generally behaves. Now we are switching gear a little, and I'm moving away from the grays with a blue hue, and I'm using neutral grays for the next steps. What this does is mimic the bright light reflections, the lightest highlights we get on polished and very reflective surfaces. And these are usually influenced more by the makeup of the surface and the color of the light source, and not the ambience. I'm using Army Painter's Ash Gray. That looks bright on these darker colors we used up until now, but still leaves a lot of room to go brighter. You see that just adding the first layer gives this a completely different quality and feeling, and I'm making sure not to cover too much of the blue-gray, as that would undo a lot of the work we did before. On spherical shapes, I keep these very confined. You basically just want this to be a specular highlight, leaving some room for the last white highlight, but again, you don't want to undo too much of the blue-gray. And then I'm putting more focus on the edges in a very similar way. And just because of the change in hue, this really is starting to give off a metallic, bright and shiny armor vibe, even before I put in that last brightest highlight. I promised you 2 more insights into what I realized again during this video. First of all, painting freely and not technique focused, just painting with a brush and regular acrylics is what I enjoy the most. And second, ironically, painting like this is very often viewed as slow and complicated, but once you understand where you have to put the brush stroke to sell the effect, it's super fast. I don't have to prepare any enamel or oil products. I don't need to switch tools for cleanup or for adding another step. There's no waiting for layers to dry, no airbrush to clean. I can just mix paint on the palette, clean my brush in water, go back and forth with layers of paint using my creative brain instead of my technical brain. Something I always tell students, and I did this already in the video without pointing the educational value out, is to add contrast first and smoothness later. Both when it comes to the actual brush strokes you are putting down, like one opaque layer first and then blend that together later, but also on a more meta level when trying to figure out painting at a lower experience level. First figure out where that highlight has to go and make it bold and contrasting and finish a few minutes like that, and then learning how to blend is just going to come naturally. So as I said, the last highlight that goes on is pure white, and again you can see that it is mostly small specks or thin lines, and I'm really just focusing it on the edges or in the middle of sphere highlights. And only on very exposed areas I make them a little wider, like the collar or that foot stepping forward on the tactical rock. So as always, I'm giving you the big ideas that I'm using to paint this mini. And there's just no way I can go into full detail on a platform where the biggest metric to decide whether a video gets buried or shown is retention. And because of that, I decided to create the PDF guide to go along with this video. And I'll upload it to my Patreon in the next few days. Just needs a bit more polishing. So if you want the info on your table to be able to catch up at the flick of a page and a lot more info on top, go check it out. My Patreon is linked in the description. And just for illustration's sake, I decided to do one black element in a different quality. So what I grabbed here is a warm gray, basically meaning it has some brown or red in it. I put down a highlight with the mix I created and blended the transitions with a black glaze. Then I used pure dark sea gray and I slapped a quick highlight on the edges and cleaned it up with black. To make it more interesting, I added some lines and dots as this would obviously get more wear, and then added a few specks of white to these larger dents. So if we compare this to the bluish black, it looks a lot more boring, but I think it works in the context of this being a more battered and rough surface, so a more dull look was the way to go. For the trim, I wanted to go a relatively bright metal that could pass as polished steel, just like we see in this reference, and I recycled the same colors I used for the black, starting more from a blue-gray as a main color, and I sketched in the highlight parts. I did extend the highlights into the writing, just leaving the recesses black. I framed the trim parts in edge highlights and then blended the transitions with thinned down layers of paint again. Obviously, since this was supposed to be metal, I needed to bring back some black where I lost it, for maximizing the contrast. I highlighted this up with the blue-gray I had on my palette, usually starting by laying down edge highlights, as I always make these wider than the highlights on the surface, and then followed this up with white highlights in very much the same way. I always pick a direction for my brush strokes that I stick to when doing this type of non-metallic metal, especially on large surfaces. Usually I pick an angle of 45 degrees against the frame, and very similar to how I paint cylinders, this helps with keeping the illusion of lines in the reflection patterns and helps cover up any imperfect strokes. Now, of course, I also had to highlight the relief writing on the shield, and while that may sound daunting, it's really super easy, and I would say this is probably quicker than painting it with regular metallics. All I did was drag the brush over the upper edges of the letters, so anything that's facing straight up, and of course also touching these angled edges like on the A's or N's. On an R or a B, I would also hit that small horizontal edge facing up inside the bellies. Of course, the main challenge here is mixing your paint so it's not too runny and making sure it covers in one quick stroke. You don't want to have to go back in and fiddle around in tight spaces like that. I made sure the paint I used was bright, but not pure white yet, so I could still put in that brightest reflection with white, and after I established where it went on the trims, I went back to the writing and I also placed white highlights roughly in line with the main reflections, so again that 45-degree angle, and then focused on these edges again that would catch more light. And I don't care what anyone says, this is fun, quick, and I'm in control, and it's such a high impact way of painting, creating contrast with just a few deliberate brushstrokes. I had to do some cleanup again because the recesses separating the inside and the trim of the shield got covered by too much white. And then I put some lost exaggerated white specular lights on and some dots of whites to break up the monotonous edges. I never really liked painting gold non-metallic metal, but I think that was mainly because I had this idealized picture of how gold is supposed to look that I couldn't achieve, and it was only when I realized that gold comes in many hues that can all be credible, it got fun to play with. I generally start from a reddish brown that I just mix from red and black and a little yellow. Then I'm mixing an ochre that I use to apply the midtones. The skull obviously is a sphere and I highlight it that way. And then I leave some of the brown to separate the elements, and I highlight the ridge around the eyes, the back of the nose and mouth box area, and then also the smaller features like the bones. For the inquisitorial symbol, I went with the main highlight running down vertically and then painted a few smaller bands outwards. Obviously, I'm also framing everything in edge highlights while I do that. And next I'm grabbing a more orange yellow because I want that rich yellow hue in there, and start with the edges. And then cover less area within the already highlighted parts. And I think at this point everything is starting to come together. Whenever I want more warmth in the golds, I'm grabbing an orange brown like this scrag brown here and glaze it over the transitions. Then I'm grabbing a brighter yellow and continue the patterns. Last highlight goes on with a mix of this yellow and white, and to maximize the contrast I put out dots of white in some corners And then I quickly treat the rest of the elements I wanted gold the same way. I think minimal, color-rich gold ornaments like the skull on the chest or the handle of the hammer are really effective, especially against the dark and cold black armor. For the metal arm, I grabbed the same colors I already used for the armor and the shield and mixed the dark gray again, this time making sure my main color was leaning more on the side of turquoise. Before I painted any highlights, I did add some orange brown on anything facing down. In this case I used Mournfang brown, and the idea was that the ground would reflect in anything this shiny, and I knew I wanted to go for a Martian soil type base on this one. After I had these parts covered, I mixed a brighter color by adding some of the blue-gray, and again I made sure this would read as a bright turquoise, and then started to add highlights. On the shoulder that had the lettering, again I made sure that the shapes would receive highlights as if they were normal space marine pauldrons. And obviously it's good to go back and look at references, like this artwork shows exactly what I wanted to go for. So that oval shape at the top that extends into a more cylindrical highlight to the front, and then I highlighted all the edges of the letters facing up like I did on the shield. In the same vein as before, I'm adding a neutral gray at this point to the light reflections in the typical line pattern before adding white again for the last highlight step. At this point I finally realized this mini is only black and metal, and we already went over the colors I used a couple of times, so instead I'll walk you through my thoughts for the highlight patterns on the hammer. If you need inspirations for shapes like these, shine a light on the mini while it is still only in black primer, turn it around and take a few reference pictures, and then choose an angle that you find interesting. But I'm telling you, you can literally just start any way you want. As long as you follow a few general rules, or let's call them guidelines, you'll be totally fine. Starting from a dark bluish color, you can never go wrong with highlighting the edges. And then I'm painting the first segment, and I just sketch a highlight from dark to bright. And then for any adjacent elements, I will try to make sure there is never too dark or too bright areas meeting. Also again, since this is supposed to be metal, we need to keep dark areas and maximize the contrast. And once that is established, the only thing left to do is to gradually work through these brighter colors and cover less and less area on the established highlights. After another layer of blue-gray, we're grabbing a neutral gray again, or just mix in more and more white at this point and make these elements that face your general light source the brightest. Next, I'm torturing myself a little by painting yellow or black, but after just 3 thin coats I had a consistent layer and could continue with my pauldron shenanigans. I'm also doing the trim in Space Wolf's baby blue. Next I'm slapping on Cassandra yellow, making sure it stays in the recesses and also collects on the underside as a shadow color. But of course, being a Games Workshop wash, it just wanted to creep into the recesses, and once dry it was gone from the shadow area. So I had to glaze in a little scrag brown to compensate, and pushing the pigments downwards to create the gradient. Using the brighter deep yellow, I added a highlight, again first applying an opaque layer and then smoothing out these edges gradually. And of course I also shaded and highlighted the wolf gray. The gray received a simple highlight, just an extension of the light established in the yellow. Then I defined the edges and shaded the dark parts a little. Personally, I don't like the raised shoulders that came with the set, so I simply used a decal. That means for some of my other members of this kill team, I'll have to do some freehanding to get the chapter symbols down, but I'm already looking forward to that. For the face, I slapped down a lot of premix colors on my palette, because when doing faces I just want to have all these typical options to adjust on the fly. I'm starting from a dark red-brown tone that I apply to the sides mostly. Usually I will also apply them to the cheeks and the chin, but my guy here has a majestic beard. And then I will cover the front of the face with the sunny skin tone that I desaturate a bit with brown. This creates the base for these bright tones within a face that are mostly influenced by a bone structure. And then we want to be in control where the richer and warmer colors go, like the recesses and the more fleshy areas. So around the eyes and the nose and also the cheeks, I'm adding some red to a rosy skin tone, And I create these warmer tones in the shadows, and I'm also going over the temple area to create a transition from the bright skin to the darker sides. And that's starting to draw everything together and make the face look a lot more alive already. But it takes a little cleanup in areas where the paint spilled a bit too much. At this point I'm also blocking in the hair and the beard colors with a warm gray that I created from a mix of sunny skin tone, a little brown and a little black to tone down saturation. Using a more rosy skin tone, I'm creating a bit of separation in the facial features, which becomes a natural extension of the red-black sides of the face. And this gives a bit of depth, but also again makes the face look more alive. Then it's back to the yellowish and bright sunny skin tone, and I block in the major light catchers, nose, cheeks and forehead. I like to set up my last highlight that will be desaturated with these yellow and warm colors. It's very similar to what we did with the armor. First we built the color quality with a saturated color, and then we used the desaturated brighter tones to build the actual white. The faces are very reflective surfaces, so we can give them a similar treatment. I'm going brighter with this mix. It's still clearly a little yellow as you can see, and I cover less area, and then using my cold gray, in this case glacier blue, I put in specks of these brightest highlights that contrast against the main quality of color on the face. I wanted the hair to be parts gray and parts dirty blonde, so I used the blue-gray for the middle strain and the front of the beard, and mixed the yellow to the base color for the rest. I gradually highlighted this up and focusing mostly on these apex points and curves as usual. For the bases I started the stones off from a dark desaturated green and highlighted them up by mixing in more and more neutral gray, focusing on edges and adding texture. I also added one of the brighter mixes to the rest of the soil and gave that one highlight before I went ahead and dumped a lot of liquid pigment on this. I mixed 2 brown tones to add some variety and then dumped a lot of enamel thinner on top so it would creep into the recesses properly, just like any dust would. Now being almost done, I realized that I forgot to add the company markings on the knee, and it meant getting rid of this highlight that turned out really well. What a shame. I know I could just leave it blank to have them be part of watch company primers, but I really like the speck of color and the white number contrasting against the black. So I quickly painted a red stripe and highlighted it back up by mixing in skin color and then placing a specular highlight with a blue-gray again. And put some black over the red stripe to make it look like the paint flaked off a little. I just had to apply the decal in the usual way, and since the decals are glossy, I hit them with a few layers of AK Ultramont varnish by brush, which makes them integrate into the paint job seamlessly. Okay, that was a long one. So when we look at the result, let me just say again that I really enjoyed just painting away and I really wanted to share the fun I had while painting this model with you. And maybe a little insight or two more than usual. And who knows, if this type of video is well received, I'd be happy to do longer videos again. If you're still watching at this point, maybe today is the day I deserved your subscription. Remember to keep an eye out for the guide on my Patreon and keep pushing that pigment, and see you in the next one.